taking up arms and continue to make Molotov cocktails to fight off Russian forces.
Well, while Ukraine presents a stiff resistance to Russia on the battleground, Western powers are ramping up sanctions even further against Vladimir Putin's government. The US, UK, Europe, and Canada moving to block Russia's access to the SWIFT international payment system, as well as restrict Russia's central bank's access to international reserves. Well, the measures will be implemented in the coming days. Ursula von der Leyen, president of the EU Commission, making the announcement late on Saturday in coordination with other powers. Let's listen in.
The European Union and its partners are working to cripple Putin's ability to finance his war machine. I will now propose to EU leaders the following measures. First, we commit to ensuring that a certain number of Russian banks are removed from SWIFT. This will ensure that these banks are disconnected from the international financial system and harm their ability to operate globally. Cutting banks off will stop them from conducting most of their financial transactions worldwide and effectively block Russian exports and imports. We will stop Putin from using his war chest. We will paralyze the assets of Russia's central bank. This will freeze its transactions, and it will made it impossible for the central bank to liquidate assets. All of these measures will significantly harm Putin's ability to finance his war.
Well, Ukraine's prime minister reacted on Twitter, saying he is grateful for the latest round of financial sanctions imposed on Russia. Well, for more on this story, let's turn to France 24's European Affairs editor, Catherine Nicholson, joining us on the line now. Catherine, thank you for joining us. So Germany was originally skeptical about this move to cut Russia off the SWIFT international payment system. What's changed?
Well, indeed, the US, United Kingdom and Canada have been on board with this measure for some days, and they've really been leaning on the EU's 27 member states to join them. And I think that's the key here. The EU is not one federal body like the United States government. It is 27 individual different governments that have to come together unanimously on sanctions. So we know that Germany, also Italy, Austria and Hungary had been some of the member states that were reluctant to get on board with this, particularly on excluding Russian banks from the SWIFT payment system, concerns about how it would harm companies in their own countries and what that would mean for their wider economies. But a majority of EU states have been seen as supporting of these measures. And we've seen at demos and rallies that have been held all around the world today and yesterday, a lot of placards saying the word SWIFT, calling for this measure to be imposed. Quite an astonishing level, I think, of grassroots support for this, especially given that many of us hadn't probably even heard of SWIFT until quite recently, and certainly weren't au fait with the ins and outs of it. So this adding pressure, and earlier this Saturday, Germany softened its stance. That was pretty massive, given that Germany is the EU's biggest and richest member state, with a lot of trade with Russia, Russian companies. Hungary then also joining its EU neighbours late on Saturday. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban is close to Vladimir Putin. He has warm relations with him and has previously openly criticised EU sanctions on Russia. But both those states are joining the cause on Saturday evening, leading to Ursula von der Leyen's announcement that you heard part of just there. And it has been welcomed by other EU leaders. Just to cite one of them, Alexander De Croo, who's the Prime Minister of Belgium, which is where SWIFT is actually based, saying he welcomes this. Russia's brutalities need to be responded to with severe financial sanctions that bite, Alexander De Croo saying just a few minutes ago.
Well, it's not just about the SWIFT system, other measures targeting the Russian central bank and also the provisioning of golden passports to wealthy Russians. What's the overall goal of this new sanctions package?
Well, in the words of Ursula von der Leyen, it is about making Russia pay the highest price possible for what it is doing in Ukraine, for the invasion and the suspected war crimes being committed by Russia. She says it's about continuing to impose massive costs on Russia, on the state, on its economy, and further isolating Russia from European financial systems and economies than had been already achieved with earlier EU and international sanctions. So as you said, SWIFT, the one that we've been focusing on, this is the biggest global interbank payment system. It will stop Russia from conducting most of its financial transactions worldwide and effectively block Russian exports and imports. We know that Russia is reliant on SWIFT for its oil and gas export transactions, and oil and gas, of course, hugely important to the Russian economy. In terms of the other measures that you mentioned, freezing assets of the Russian central bank, this is another huge measure. It's very rare. It does happen occasionally, but just for an example, the United States up to now has only ever sanctioned the central banks of Iran, Venezuela, and North Korea, 3 states that have a degree of pariah status around the world. And this is the first time that the central bank of a G20 country has been sanctioned in this way. It could reduce the Bank of Russia's ability to support its currency, the ruble. This is likely to lead to inflation in Russia, leading to cost of living rises that will put a lot of financial harm on ordinary Russians and potentially then pressure on Vladimir Putin to do something about it. In terms of the measures regarding oligarchs, there's been a lot of focus on this as well. Just a few days ago, a British lawmaker read out a list of more than 30 Russian billionaires with assets and business in the United Kingdom who she said ought to be sanctioned. These ultra-wealthy Russians, very close to Vladimir Putin, many of them, and they certainly have influence on Vladimir Putin. So much of the country's wealth is held in their hands. So one of the intentions of these measures to get those oligarchs to pressure Vladimir Putin to change his course regarding Ukraine.
Yeah, Kat Nicholson reporting there, on our European Affairs editor. Well, existing sanctions are being implemented. Case in point, a Russian cargo ship intercepted and impounded by French naval forces in the Channel this Saturday. The ship, called the Baltic Leader, was heading from the French city of Rouen to St. Petersburg and was carrying a shipment of new cars. It was in breach of sanctions imposed because of the invasion, as it's owned by one of the Russian banks that's been affected. Well, this is part of a coordinated response from Western powers, and the Biden administration is obviously a big part of that. One U.S. official saying that Russia's central bank is now unable to support its own currency. Well, let's turn to France 24's Ketevan Gorgistani, our Washington, D.C. Correspondent. The U.S. Says Russia is now a global economic and financial pariah. Can you tell us, we've heard from the European perspective, what are you hearing from the White House about these new sanctions that they're saying?
Well, as you said, that word pariah, that's really the goal of the Biden administration, really shutting out Putin's Russia from the global financial system. And we were briefed by a senior administration official earlier after that announcement came out, and that official really detailed specifically how these sanctions would be working. They started with, of course, the removal of these institutions from the SWIFT banking system, saying that that would harm their ability to do business globally, and then focusing on the sanctions on the Russian central bank, basically saying that that was meant to prevent the Russian central bank from sort of getting around and protecting the Russian economy from the impact of the sanctions on removing those institutions from SWIFT. They also mentioned the fact that they were going to prevent those golden passports, preventing those Russian oligarchs close to the Russian government, those sanctions officials from using possibly citizenship from other countries to sort of bypass those sanctions. Again, trying to work in coordination to avoid any loopholes that the Russian economy or Russian officials could try to use to get around. That official saying that there would be a task force that would be created starting next week to sort of identify and freeze the assets of those officials. He said yachts, mansions, fancy cars, money, ability to send their kids to fancy colleges around the world. All of that will be targeted by that task force. One last thing that official talked about was the question of whether the energy sector will be involved in these sanctions. Possibly, of course, the fact that there could be payments through SWIFT made in that energy sector. The official said that they hadn't really determined how they would